Summer in Alabama carries a weight that goes beyond the heat. It's a living thing that slides down from the hills, slips through the open windows of old houses, and settles in the lungs like a memory you never asked for. The July nights in the Talladega Mountain region carry that same weight. Humid, slow, full of sounds the city never hears and that the locals have learned, over generations, not to question. John Calloway had learned that since childhood. Son of a farmer, grandson of a farmer, a man forged from that reddish earth that stained boots and wouldn't come out no matter how hard you scrubbed. 59 years old, salt and pepper hair, blue eyes that had already seen more hardship than any man should, and a pair of broad shoulders that the weight of the years still hadn't managed to bend. He had served in the army for nearly 2 decades, come back to the farm when his father took ill, buried his father, raised his daughter alone after his wife's death, and each of those chapters had left a mark he carried with that quiet dignity the men of the region respected without needing to name it. The Calloway farm was the largest in the county. 400 acres of fertile land, wide pastures stretching to where the forest began, and the forest climbing the mountain slopes like a green and impenetrable wall that marked the boundary between the world of men and something the elders called only the other side. John raised purebred horses, thoroughbreds, quarter horses, Arabians, animals of impeccable lineage that had won competitions in 5 different states. The farm had a name, had a history, had the kind of reputation that takes decades to build, and that people in the region mentioned with that particular mixture of admiration and respect which in small communities is worth more than money. But John was getting older. Not dramatically, not in a way he'd easily admit, but the body doesn't lie the way pride would like. The mornings were harder. His knees complained before the coffee was done, and the farm, with its infinite demands, required more than he was capable of giving with the same ease as before. That was why Charlie Morrow arrived. 48 years old, fair-haired, tall, lean with that dry leanness of a man who had worked his whole life outdoors. Green eyes the strange color of a lake's depths when sunlight hits at a low angle, a color that seemed to shift depending on where you were standing. He had arrived with a backpack, an impeccable resume from farms in 4 different states, and a quiet manner that John recognized immediately as the manner of a man accustomed to being alone. Charlie had no family, no children, no fixed address beyond wherever he was working at any given moment. He arrived, stayed, moved on. He left no roots. John had interviewed other men with better references on paper, with more open smiles, with the kind of easy conversation that makes decisions simpler. But he had chosen Charlie. He couldn't explain exactly why, and men of John's generation didn't spend much time trying to explain the things they couldn't. There was something in the way Charlie handled the horses, a silent language between him and the animals that John had observed during the practical interview, that convinced him more than any reference. The horses liked Charlie, and purebred horses are the most honest creatures in existence when it comes to human character. Charlie had arrived 3 months earlier. He did his work with efficiency and precision. He spoke little, observed much, and sometimes John found him standing at the edge of the property where it met the forest, staring into the trees with an expression John couldn't name, but that unsettled him in a way he also couldn't quite explain. Meg Calloway had arrived 2 weeks after Charlie. 28 years old, fair-skinned, eyes as blue as her father's, dark hair she'd inherited from her mother. A law degree from the University of Alabama, with honors, with the seriousness of a woman who had spent 6 years in Tuscaloosa building a future with her own hands, and without needing to use her father's last name to open doors. She had been hired by a firm in Birmingham right after graduation, had worked there for 2 years, and then a phone call with her father had changed something. John hadn't asked her to come back, but there was something in his voice, in those bi-weekly calls, that Meg heard with more attention than the words conveyed, a tiredness he would never admit and that she recognized because she had grown up learning to read what her father didn't say. So she came back. She opened a small office in Harpsville, the nearest town, and began splitting her time between local cases and her father's farm. It was, she told friends who'd stayed in Birmingham, the best of both worlds. What she didn't say, because Meg Calloway also had her father's habit of keeping the things she couldn't name, was that there was something about the farm, about those mornings smelling of wet earth and strong coffee, those afternoons when the sun fell over the pastures and painted everything a gold that no city could imitate, that she had missed during all 6 years away without ever fully admitting it. She had arrived and found Charlie, and between the two of them there had occurred that strange thing that sometimes happens between people who under normal circumstances would have no reason to notice each other, an immediate and inexplicable recognition, as if some part of both of them knew something that the conscious part was still processing. Meg had found him intriguing in the way you find intriguing something you can't categorize. Charlie had looked at her with those Green Lake deep eyes and said only good morning, and had gone back to work, and Meg had stood still for a beat longer than necessary before going on her way. John had noticed. John noticed most things. It was a summer night of the kind that Alabama produces with an almost offensive generosity, warm, perfumed with wild jasmine, with a sky full of stars that the absence of light pollution made absolutely shameless in its abundance. John was in the covered arena with 3 of his most senior hands, working on breaking 2 quarter horses that had arrived that week, young animals, full of wild energy, that needed experienced hands and infinite patience. Meg had come down to watch. It was the kind of thing she had done her whole life, as a child, sitting on the fence of the arena with her legs dangling over the outside and watching her father work with the horses, hypnotized by that conversation between man and animal that needed no words. Charlie was there too, leaning against a post of the barn, arms folded, that way he had of being present without participating, of observing without inserting himself. More farm hands drifted over, some who lived on the property, finishing their shifts and gravitating naturally to the arena because there wasn't much else to do on a Wednesday night in rural Alabama. Conversation flowed, stories came, as they always do when a group of people shares a space and a time without the urgency of any particular obligation. Someone brought up the rider. It was Donnie, one of the older ranch hands, a man of 62 who had been born 3 miles from the farm and who carried in every line of his face the history of those mountains. The phantom rider of the Talladega Mountains was not exactly a legend. It was more than that. It was a presence, something the oldest residents of the region discussed with the same matter-of-fact naturalness with which they discussed the weather and the harvests, because it had reached the status of those things that simply belong to the reality of a place, whether you believe in them or not. The oldest story Donnie knew had been told by his great-great-grandfather, a faceless rider, mounted on a black horse, who appeared on summer nights among the trees on the slopes. Always in the mountains. Always at night. And always, Donnie made a point of this part, always before something. Before what? Asked one of the younger ranch hands, in the tone of someone who wants to demonstrate he's not afraid of an old man's story. Before something, Donnie repeated, with that quiet firmness of a man who isn't trying to convince anyone. My grandmother saw him in 1962, 3 days before the hurricane that took the barn and 2 of the neighbors. Mr. Calloway's father saw him in 1978, and the following week 2 horses died for no apparent reason. The vet couldn't explain it. And in 1995, right when my cousin was going to marry the fellow from Sylacauga, 3 people in the county claimed they'd seen the rider on the edge of the mountain road. The wedding didn't happen. The groom disappeared the night before without leaving word. There was silence. Not the silence of fear, but that peculiar silence that old stories produce even in people who don't believe them. As if some primitive part of the brain, the part that existed before rationality, recognized something true in the tone even when the mind refuses the content. Meg smiled. It wasn't a smile of mockery. Meg was too intelligent for that. but it was the smile of a 28-year-old woman with 6 years of law school and 2 in a law firm, hearing a ghost story with the comfortable detachment of someone who is certain she's standing on the outside of it. "I've never believed those stories," she said, and her voice had that lightness that belongs to those who have never had reason to believe. "With all due respect, Donnie." "I know, sweetheart," said the old man, without offense. "You're not obligated to believe." Charlie said nothing. But John, who had been watching Charlie the way he had learned to watch everything he didn't fully understand, saw the man's shoulders go slightly rigid at the sound of the story. A minimal stiffness, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountains when Meg decided to ride. It was a spontaneous thing, the kind that arises naturally on those lazy evenings. Her usual horse, Copper, a calm-tempered chestnut quarter horse she had ridden since she was 17, was saddled and available in the stable because one of the hands had planned an earlier ride and changed his mind. Meg could ride better than most people she knew. She had grown up on the backs of horses the same way other children grow up on bicycles. "Taking a ride?" asked John, with that paternal neutrality of a father who knows his adult daughter doesn't need permission, but who can't fully switch off the protective mode. "Just out to the stone lake and back," she said, adjusting the stirrup. "I want to see the sunset from there." "Don't go up into the mountains, Meg. It's getting dark." "Dad, I've known that path since I was 12. John didn't answer, and Donnie, who had heard everything, looked in the direction Meg was heading and then at the sky and said nothing, because he had learned over 62 years that certain people need to reach their own conclusions, and that there is no force in the world capable of convincing a young and intelligent person that there is something they don't know. Charlie, leaning against the post, looked at the forest. The Stone Lake was a 20-minute ride along the flat trail that cut through the pastures before entering the forest. It was a place Meg loved with that particular intensity people develop for the places where they were happy during childhood. A small pond ringed with smooth gray stones, fed by a spring that came down from the mountains, so clear you could see the bottom even at the deepest point. In summer, the sunset arrived exactly over the treetops on the western side and painted the water orange and pink in a way Meg had tried to describe to college friends and had given up on because some things don't transfer into words. She arrived exactly in time. The sun still had enough to bathe the stones in a golden light that warmed their gray tone almost to bronze, and the water reflected all of it with a fidelity that seemed almost insistent. Copper drank with that animal satisfaction horses express without any reserve, plunging his muzzle into the water and lifting his head afterward to shake his ears. Meg sat still in the saddle, her feet out of the stirrups, her mind in that rare state of productive emptiness the city had never been able to offer. 2 years in Birmingham, and she had forgotten what this silence was like. Not the absence of sound. The forest was never silent. There were crickets. There was the rustling of trees. There was the sound of water. But the absence of that constant, invisible background noise that urban life produces and that you only realize was there when it stops. Then something changed. It wasn't a sound at first. It was an absence. The crickets stopped. Not gradually. Not the way it sometimes happens when a predator passes nearby and the silence spreads like a discrete wave. They stopped all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that settled in was not the silence she had appreciated moments before. It was something else. It was compressed. It was charged in the same way the air gets charged before a storm, when the atoms behave in a way physics can explain, but which the body registers before the mind processes. Copper lifted his head from the water. Meg felt the change in the animal before she could identify it. A tension that started in the muscles of his neck and propagated down his back like an electric current, making the horse's ears swivel forward with that military precision horses use when they focus all their attention on something. He was staring at the trees on the north side of the lake. Staring, but with that abnormal stillness that was not the stillness of attention. It was the stillness of fear that hasn't yet decided which direction to run. Meg looked at the trees. At first there was nothing. Darkness between trunks, overlapping shadows, the occasional faint glow of a firefly amid the green. But there was something more, a feeling, a sensation of directional weight that she couldn't locate in any of her senses, and which was for that reason even more disturbing. The certainty of being watched. Not the occasional paranoia of someone alone in an isolated place, but something more specific, more directed, more conscious than that. A branch broke. Dry, loud, sharp as a gunshot. Copper exploded. It was not a gradual reaction, not the nervous start of a frightened horse that allows an experienced rider to intervene. It was an explosion of pure, immediate, overwhelming panic, as if that sound had triggered something so ancient and so deep in the animal's instincts that there was no space between the stimulus and the response. The horse lunged forward with the full force of his 1,100 pounds, and Meg, caught completely off guard with her feet out of the stirrups, used everything she knew to avoid falling. She folded over the animal's neck, grabbed his mane with both hands, shifted her weight as best she could to center. Copper plunged into the forest like a projectile. Branches struck her arms, her legs, her face. She closed her eyes and held on, because falling from a panicked horse at that speed between trees would be the worst of all scenarios. And she kept her eyes closed for perhaps 30 seconds that felt like an hour while the horse zigzagged between trunks with that certainty of escape that horses possess, that survival GPS that doesn't depend on vision. When she opened her eyes, the forest had changed. There were no more clearings, no more the openness the trail had offered. There was only dense brush, and Copper was still running, and she knew, with the part of her mind that kept functioning practically even in the midst of terror, that trying to rein in the animal under those conditions was useless. So she let go. It was a conscious, calculated, and simultaneously wrong decision. She threw herself sideways as the horse turned sharply, rolled on the damp ground, and lay face down in the earth while the sound of Coppa's hooves faded and then disappeared. The silence returned, this time heavier still. Meg lay on the ground for a long moment, taking inventory of her body with the efficiency of someone trained to think under pressure. Nothing broken, nothing more than scrapes and bruises she'd assess better tomorrow. She sat up, looked around, tried to identify some point of reference. There was none. The forest was uniform in every direction. Trunks and shadows and more trunks and more shadows. Without the logic she had learned to recognize in the forest of the pastures. That forest had trails, had clearings, had the natural markers that anyone who grows up in a place learns to use without realizing they're using them. This part of the mountains she knew less well. She had been here a few times as a child, always with her father, always in daytime, and childhood had not equipped her adult memory with the details she needed now. She breathed. She chose a direction based on the position of the moon as it entered obliquely through the treetops. She began to walk. She walked for 20 minutes before accepting that she was walking in circles. Not because she knew this from any concrete evidence, but because the forest was refusing to change in a way that made her understand, at an instinctive level, that something was wrong with the direction she had chosen. As if the forest were rearranging itself. As if the paths she took were closing behind her and opening ahead of her, but not where she expected. It was when night truly closed and that despair tried to enter. Meg recognized it arriving. That acceleration of the heart that was no longer the adrenaline of a scare, that breathing that wanted to shorten, that spiraling thought that begins with "now what?" and quickly descends to darker places. She recognized it and named it, because she had learned, during her first year of college when overwork had knocked her down with an anxiety attack that left her bedridden for 2 days, that naming panic is the first thing to do to keep it from possessing you. Panic. This is panic. You are fine. You are not injured. You have legs. You have your senses. You have known this kind of forest since you were a child. Think. She thought. Her father would notice she hadn't come back. Copper would arrive at the farm without her. They would come looking. The Calloway farm had men, had flashlights, had radios, had horses that knew those mountains. She needed to make noise when she heard any sign of them. And until then, she needed to stay in one place and stay calm. She found a rock large enough to sit on, with her back protected by an oak trunk whose diameter would have taken 3 people holding hands to encircle. She sat. She hugged her own knees. And that was when the cold arrived. It wasn't the natural cold of a summer night in the countryside. July nights in Alabama can turn pleasant, but not cold. This cold was different. It was local, it was directed. It was the kind of cold you feel when you pass beneath a tree that spent a full sun-filled day in shade while everything around it warmed. Except there was no logic of light or shadow to explain that cold at that moment in that place. And then she heard the hoofbeats. The sound came from far away, cadenced, regular, with that patience of something that is not in a hurry because it knows it will arrive regardless. Meg stayed motionless on the rock, arms still hugging her knees, and listened. The sound grew. It grew the way a footstep grows when it approaches. Not faster, not in response to the urgency of any situation, simply nearer, as if the distance between the sound and her was shrinking by the mere fact of time passing. And stopped. Meg looked to the right, in the direction from which the sound had come. The rider was among the trees. She had thought, in the hours before, that there were things worse than being lost alone in a forest at night. She had imagined scenarios, a wild animal, a fall, total disorientation with no point of reference. She had not imagined this. She had not, with all her analytical capacity and all her professional experience of building and anticipating scenarios, come anywhere close to imagining this. It was a figure that was too tall. Not grotesquely so, not in a way that violated human proportions entirely, but tall enough that the mind registered the error before it could process it. Mounted on a horse the color of a space without light, not black like the night, not black like ink, but black in the way that a place is black when light has never been there because it never had the chance to enter. The horse did not move. It did not breathe visibly, did not toss its head with that constant restlessness horses have even when standing still. It was motionless with an immobility that living horses do not have. The rider wore dark clothes, a long coat, a wide-brimmed hat that belonged to another century without seeming anachronistic. They simply seemed correct, as if the time in which that figure existed was a different time from the time in which Meg existed, and the two were overlapping here in that moment in a way that should not have been possible. And where a face should have been, there was only absence. Not darkness, not shadow, not fabric or mask. Absence, like a hole in space shaped like a face. Meg opened her mouth. No sound came out. The figure tilted its head to one side, slowly, with the gesture that on anything else would be curiosity, and on it was wrong in a way Meg could not categorize, but that her body categorized immediately, because her body was running a fear response unlike anything she had ever felt before. Not the acceleration of danger, not the adrenaline of a concrete threat, but something older and more primitive, something that had been stored in the instincts of the species since before it had a name. The scream that came out when it came out was involuntary and total, tore through her throat with a completeness that made it hurt, and the birds exploded from the trees in every direction as if the scream had launched them. And when Meg opened her eyes, the space between the trees where the rider had been was empty. There was no trace. There was no sound of hooves leaving. There was only emptiness where that thing had been, and Meg stared at that emptiness with absolute certainty, with the certainty that no rationality could now undo, that there was something in that forest that did not belong to the world she had inhabited until that night. She ran. Back at the farm, Copper had arrived alone 43 minutes after Meg had left. John Calloway had seen frightened horses before. He had seen horses that had been through accidents, encounters with predators, situations of justifiable panic. What he saw in Kappa's eye when the animal came trotting alone through the gate was different. It was the kind of terror that has no origin the animal can process. The terror of something that exists outside the parameters of the world the animal knows. He didn't need to think. Decades of military training and decades of farming had produced in him the ability to act before feeling, to organize before understanding. Radios were distributed, flashlights retrieved. The men grouped into 3 teams of 3. He went himself with Charlie and Donnie, because he wanted Charlie where he could see him and wanted Donnie's experience to navigate the mountains in the dark. The forest received the 3 groups with that silence Donnie recognized immediately and that John, who had spent enough time in those mountains, also recognized but did not name. It was the earlier silence. The silence the crickets make when they stop. Charlie walked at the front of John's group. He walked with a confidence that was not the confidence of someone who knows a place. It was deeper than that, more instinctive. He stepped around roots without looking at them. He chose forks in the path without hesitating. He moved through those trees like someone who carries the memory of a place in his body rather than his head. "You know this forest?" said John. It was not a question. Charlie answered without turning. "I know this kind of forest." It was not an answer. It was the kind of non-answer someone gives when they don't want to lie directly. Meg's scream arrived before John could ask his next question. It came from the southeast, sharp and clear, and the 3 men were already running before the echo dissolved among the trees. The flashlights swung, shadows leapt, and Charlie ran faster than the other 2 men, even being the one who least knew the place, or who should have known at least. They found Meg sitting on the ground, leaning against a trunk, her knees hugged to her chest, her eyes fixed on a point in the darkness that the other 3 looked at and saw nothing. John went to her and held her with that force fathers keep for moments when they realize with every cell in their bodies what it would mean to lose that. Meg let herself be held for a moment. Then she pulled back just enough to look at her father and then at the dark space behind him. "Dad?" she said, in a voice John hadn't heard since she was 4 years old and woke in the night from a nightmare. There was something here. "You got lost, sweetheart. When a person—" It wasn't my mind. Charlie was standing behind the group. John turned and looked at him. Charlie was not looking at Meg. He was looking at the trees, not with the skepticism of a practical man in the face of a frightened woman's story. He was looking with the recognition of someone searching for something they already know. "Let's get out of here," said Charlie. And there was in his voice, for the first time since John had hired him, something that was not his usual calm. It was urgency. It was awareness of immediate danger. They started walking. The horses the men had brought began to grow agitated before the humans in the group noticed what was happening. The animals pulled at their reins, whinnied with that high note that is not a call but a warning, refused to advance. The hands from the other group, who had joined them when they heard the scream, struggled to keep the animals under control. The sound of hoofbeats came from far away and grew close too fast, then stopped. The figure appeared on a rise to the left of the group, among the roots of an ancient tree that projected out of the earth like twisted fingers. The black horse stood motionless with that impossible stillness, and the faceless rider looked at the group, or turned the space where a face should have been in the direction of the group, which is the equivalent of what any faceless figure can do. Donnie was the only one who did not step back. He stood still, looking at the figure with that quiet immobility of someone who had anticipated this moment, and said only, softly, to no one in particular, "So it's true." John was at the front of the group, between the figure and Meg, with the protective instinct overriding everything else, and what he felt when he looked at the rider was something no military training had prepared him for. Not the fear of an enemy, not the fear of identifiable danger, but that deeper and more honest fear that human beings feel when they encounter something that does not belong to the category of things they were equipped to face. Charlie stepped forward. The rider turned the absence of its face toward him, and then something happened that no one in the group, except perhaps Donnie, had anticipated. Charlie spoke to the figure. Not aloud, not in words the others could clearly hear. It was a murmur, low and continuous, in that tone people use when speaking to something that is not quite on the same plane as they are. The words reached the others as sounds without meaning, like a familiar language heard from behind a wall, identifiable as language but not as content. The figure stood motionless. And then Donnie said to John, very quietly, without taking his eyes off the rider, "Mr. Calloway, I need to tell you something I should have told you before. About Charlie." 3 years before Charlie Morrow's arrival at the Calloway farm, a man had disappeared in those mountains. He wasn't from the area. He had come from out of state, alone, asking about the legend of the rider with the kind of urgency that is not tourist curiosity, but something more personal. The older residents had spoken with him, had told him what they knew, and he had entered the forest on a summer night at the same temperature as this one and had not come out. His name was Thomas Morrow, Charlie's brother. Donnie had recognized the last name when John introduced the new hire, but had stayed quiet because it wasn't in his nature to make connections without knowing if they were right, and he had stayed quiet for weeks, watching, trying to understand what Charlie was really looking for at that farm, in those mountains, in that specific forest. And he had arrived at the only possible conclusion. Charlie hadn't come because of horses. Charlie had come because of his brother. John looked at Charlie. Charlie was still murmuring to the figure, and the figure was still motionless, and there was something in the space between them that Meg, even with all her rationality shaken but not destroyed, perceived as a negotiation. Not the way human beings negotiate, with words and contracts and declared intentions. The way things that exist on different planes negotiate when a rare and improbable point of contact occurs. The rider raised a hand. Slow, without menace. It pointed at Meg. Charlie shook his head. He said something more firmly, more audible, not enough for words, but enough for tone, and the tone was one of refusal. The figure lowered its hand. And then, and this was what those who were present could never fully describe to those who weren't, the rider became less. It did not disappear, did not dissolve, did not go away in any particular direction. It became less. Like an image losing contrast until you realize you've been looking at the background for some time. Like a sound diminishing until you realize it had stopped before you noticed. The figure was there, and then it was less, and then it was the space between the trees with nothing in it. The crickets returned immediately. The temperature returned to what July in Alabama should feel like. The horses stopped stirring. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Meg looked at Charlie and said, "What was that?" Charlie turned to her. For the first time since he had arrived at the farm, his face was completely readable, not the calm mask of a man who keeps everything close, but the face of someone who had carried something heavy for a very long time and who was, finally, setting it down. "My brother," he said. "That was my brother." They left the forest in silence. The walk back took longer than it should have. The forest seemed to have grown strangely larger, or they slower, as if the air had a resistance it hadn't had before. No one pushed the pace. There was a tacit agreement that the silence was necessary, that things were being processed by each person in the group that needed space before words. On the porch of the farmhouse, with hot coffee that the cook had prepared without anyone asking, because she had seen the group leave and had understood, in the way people who have lived long in a place understand, that coffee would be needed when they returned. Charlie told the story. Thomas Morrow had been a historian. He had spent 15 years studying the folklore of the mountains of the American South, documenting local legends with the academic seriousness of someone who believes that what communities preserve in their stories has a value that goes beyond entertainment. He had come to Talladega County in 2021, 3 years earlier, drawn specifically by the legend of the Phantom Rider, one of the oldest and most consistent in the region, with records going back to the 18th century. Thomas had discovered, in county deed records no one had consulted in decades, that the rider had a name. In life he had been a man called Elias Crow, who had inhabited those mountains in the late 1700s, a horse breeder who had come from somewhere in the north, and who had built a homestead on the slopes with the determination of someone who makes a strange land their own by sheer force of will. He had lived there for 20 years, had raised children, had buried a wife. And he had died. This was in the county records, in a handwriting that Thomas had photographed and sent to Charlie weeks before he disappeared, on a summer night, searching for a daughter who had gotten lost in the forest. He had gone out to look for the girl and had not come back. The daughter had arrived home alone in the morning, with no explanation of where she had been all night, with no memory of what had happened after her horse bolted and she became lost. She had told them she had seen something in the mountains during the night, a figure that seemed to want to keep her from returning. The father, the records of the time noted with the same dry pragmatism that 18th century documents had, was never found. Thomas had entered the forest to verify a specific location he had identified on old maps, the place where Elias Crow's homestead had been, whose foundations probably still existed beneath 200 years of encroaching vegetation. And he had not come out. Charlie had been notified by the sheriff's department 3 weeks later, had come to the county, had helped in searches that found nothing, had stayed in a motel in Harpsville for 2 months trying to understand what had happened to his brother. And he had arrived at the only conclusion that made sense with all the information he possessed, including the kind that isn't the sort of thing you present to a police department. Thomas had found Elias Crow, not the way a historian finds a subject of research, the way it happens when someone who should not enter certain spaces enters them. When someone who lacks the knowledge or the proper protection comes too close to something that still is, for reasons 2 centuries have not resolved, trapped in that place between what was and what should have happened. Elias Crow was searching for his daughter. He had been searching for his daughter for more than 200 years, trapped in a loop of a single night that had not ended the way it should have, because Elias had died before finding her, and that incomplete death had left him in that in-between space, neither fully anchored to the past nor released into what comes after, only eternally repeating the search that had been interrupted. And every time he appeared, in Donnie's stories, in 1962, in 1978, in 1995, there was someone in the mountains who matched the pattern. A young woman, alone, lost. Elias was not haunting. Elias was searching. The problem was that Elias was no longer quite whole enough to distinguish. After 200 years in that in-between space, what was left of him had become intertwined with the mountains, with the forest, with that time outside of time where things end up when they don't find their way. And what remained of that Elias confused searching with retaining. He searched and then could not release. Not out of malice. Thomas had written this in an email to Charlie weeks before disappearing, but out of confusion. Out of that progressive forgetting of what that happens when something remains too long in a place it was never meant to stay. Thomas had become one of those retained. Not because he wanted to, not because he had chosen it. He had stayed because he had come too close without knowing what he was doing. And Elias, confusing him with what he had lost, had drawn too near, and Thomas had had no way to pull back. "So you came to find your brother," said Meg. "Yes," said Charlie. "And you knew something like this could happen to me. You knew the pattern, young woman, alone, mountains." Charlie was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know you were going to ride that evening, but you saw that I was going and said nothing." Another pause. More honest this time. "No." John looked at Charlie with that expression that was not quite anger, but was something John rarely lets show. The expression of a father who understands that someone used his daughter as a piece in something without his knowledge or consent. But there was also, mixed into that, a comprehension that the years and the army and the loss of his wife and the raising of Meg alone had produced in him. The comprehension that desperation does things to people that calm could never fully understand. "What did you say to it?" asked Donnie, who had stayed quiet throughout the story with the attention of someone filing away every detail. "Out there in the forest. What did you say?" Charlie looked at the coffee cup between his hands. "I told him she wasn't her. That it was time. That Thomas was waiting. that there was someone waiting for him too, on the other side, and that it had been a very long time. "And his daughter?" asked John. "Elias's daughter. What happened to her?" "She lived another 40 years after that night," said Charlie. "She married, had children, died of old age in another state." Elias didn't know that. After 200 years in that in-between place, I don't know how much he still knew of anything. But he needed to hear it. That she had been all right. That she had lived. That the search could stop. The silence that followed was different from all the silences of that night. It was a silence of arrival, not anticipation. "Your brother," said Meg, quieter now. "Thomas. He'll be able to." "Yes," said Charlie, before she finished. And in that single syllable, there was something that needed nothing more. The sun rose over the pastures of the Calloway farm at 6:17 that Thursday morning, the same way it had risen every previous day, with that majestic indifference of a sun that knows nothing of stories, but that warms everything equally, all the same. Meg stayed up all night. Not because she was unable to sleep. She had tried, lying in the childhood bedroom with the wooden ceiling she knew by heart, but because there were things she needed to think through completely before sleep could interrupt them. She was a woman of logic, of structure, of arguments carefully built. And there was here a substantial amount of material for which logic and structure simply had no drawer. She had seen what she had seen. There was no other way to frame it. She had tried, lying in the dark, running it through every available filter, stress, suggestion, panic-producing hallucination, and every filter had returned the image unprocessed. What she had seen did not behave like a hallucination. It did not behave like suggestion. It did not behave like anything she could reduce to a cause that made sense within the world she had inhabited until 8:42 the previous night. So she was now a woman who inhabited a different world. It was a small and enormous adjustment at the same time. She came downstairs before coffee and went to the stable. Copper was in his stall, eating with that bovine focus horses have during meals, and lifted his head when she arrived with that immediate recognition animals have for the people who tend them regularly. Meg placed her open hand on the animal's warm muzzle and stayed like that for a long moment, feeling the warmth and the breath and the solid weight of a creature completely present, completely here, with no ambiguity about the plane on which it existed. "You knew," she said to the horse. "You knew before I did." Copper kept chewing. Charlie came out of the hayloft before 7, with the punctuality of a man who for a long time has had no need of a clock because his body has learned on its own. He found Meg in the stable and stood in the doorway for a moment, as if assessing whether she wanted company. She didn't invite him, but she didn't send him away either. He came in. He began to work. The morning tasks, the routine of the animals that does not stop for any supernatural event. And they occupied the same space in silence for a while before Meg said, "You're leaving now." It was not a question. "Yes," said Charlie. "My reason for being here has passed. And you found what you came for." "I think so. Not in the way I expected. But yes." Meg looked at him with those blue eyes that were the same color as her father's, but which had, in their expression, something that was entirely her own. An analytical intensity that had spent the night processing impossible things and had arrived at morning calmer than any person had the right to be. "What Thomas was researching," she said. "About Elias. Is there a written record? Something documenting what he discovered?" Charlie looked at her. "Yes. The emails he sent me, the photographs of the county records. I have everything on my laptop." "You should leave a copy with me," said Meg. "In case someone someday wants to understand what happened here. From a historical standpoint. A legal one." She paused. "From the standpoint that sometimes the stories people tell about a place are the only archive that survived." Charlie looked at her for a moment with that expression that had appeared on the porch, the expression of a man setting something heavy down. And then, for the first time since he had arrived at the farm 3 months earlier, Charlie Morrow smiled for real. "You didn't believe in stories," he said. Meg looked at Copper, who had finished eating and was watching her with that serene and unshakable attention that horses have. "I didn't," she said. "Now I know some things." John Calloway found a new farmhand 3 weeks later. A young man from Sylacauga, with no experience with purebred horses, but with the willingness to learn and that open, secretless manner that makes decisions easy. John hired him at the first interview. Charlie left one August morning with the same backpack he had arrived with, plus a thumb drive that Meg pressed into his hand with copies of all of Thomas's documents, properly organized and cataloged with the efficiency of someone who spent 6 years learning to treat information with the respect it deserves. "For when you want to do something with it," she said, "or need someone who understands legal documentation, if it ever comes to that." He took the thumb drive, put it in his pocket, stood for a moment in the door of the old truck that had been parked at the farm entrance since the day he arrived. "Take care of yourself, Meg Calloway," he said. "Take care of yourself, Charlie Morrow," she said. He went. The dirt road that led to the main highway swallowed the truck slowly, and Meg stood still until the sound of the engine completely disappeared, replaced by the constant sounds of the farm, the horses in their stalls, the crows on the fences, the wind coming down from the mountains with that smell of pine and damp earth that she had missed during 6 years in Birmingham without ever being able to name exactly what she was missing. She looked at the mountains. The forest stood there, green and dense and full of the kind of silence she now knew to be different from ordinary silence. She knew how to recognize the difference. She knew what it means when the crickets stop. It was knowledge she had not asked for and could not return, and which with time, she felt, would become less disturbing and more simply part of what she knew about the place where she had grown up and to which she had returned. There was a daughter who came back to her father. There was a father who had gone out at night into a forest without thinking twice to find her. There was a man who had traveled through 4 states for 2 years to search for a brother in a way that maps and ordinary searches could not manage. There was a rider who had repeated for 200 years the last night of his life because that night had not ended the way it should have, and who had finally, on a Thursday in an Alabama summer with July heat clinging to the leaves and the smell of wild jasmine in the air, heard that the daughter had been all right, that she had lived, that she had married and had children and died old in another state, and that the search could stop. Sometimes the stories a place keeps are the only record that survived, Meg had said to Charlie. And there was an additional layer to that which she had noticed but not said aloud, that she was also a daughter who had gotten lost in a forest on a summer night and who had come back. Who had come back because a father had gone out at night without thinking twice. Elias Crow had been fortunate in 1799 or 1803 or whenever it had been. The daughter had come back on her own before he had reached her in time. And the happiness of that homecoming, the girl safe and sound in the morning after a night she could never quite explain, had been the last thing Elias had known before dying without knowing what had happened. He had died searching. He had stayed searching. And now he was free. Meg breathed in the morning air, that farm air of horses and earth and coffee drifting from the kitchen, and turned her back on the forest. There was work. There were cases at the Harpsville office that were waiting, a Monday meeting with a client from the city who needed representation in a probate matter that promised to be complicated, the property update inventory that she and her father had begun before all of this happened. There was, above all, life. She went inside. The mountains remained in the background, green and ancient and full of stories that no one had asked to carry, but that were carried all the same. The way places do when the stories that happen within them find no resolution and remain caught in the branches and the stones and the bottom of clear lakes where the sunset arrives at exactly the right angle in summer and paints the water a color that has no proper name and that the people of the region know but cannot explain to anyone who grew up somewhere else. In the forest, that morning, the crickets sang.